He told me I'd crumble without him, that I'd never afford the kind of life he gave me, the designer bags, the weekends in Monaco, the Ocean View estates. When he left, he laughed and took everything. But I rebuilt, quietly, strategically. Now, he spends his summers sipping champagne on a yacht he doesn't know I own. Want to hear how I turned his arrogance into my empire? Subscribe, and let me tell you. Tom's sighs, the first crack in my perfect world was a crumpled receipt on his nightstand. It wasn't the total, though $200 for dinner was obscene, even by Marcus's standards. It wasn't even the restaurant, La Sirène, the same place he took me when he proposed. What gutted me was the handwritten note scribbled in pink ink at the bottom, just above the tip line. Last night was unforgettable. XO. C. I stared at that single letter until it blurred into the wood grain beneath the glass of his custom-made side table. I don't know how long I stood there in our bedroom, barefoot in a robe, my fingers tightening around that receipt as if it could strangle the truth. Marcus always said people like me didn't survive without people like him. You're charming, baby. But charm doesn't pay for villas in Tuscany, he'd whisper as he kissed my collarbone. Be grateful. I was. God, I was so grateful. For the private chefs, the designer heels, the annual reset in St. Barthélemy. I told myself love looked different when you were rich. Less about stolen glances, more about strategic dinners and signature cocktails. I convinced myself that being chosen by a man like Marcus, a man who made deals over caviar and never repeated his cologne, was enough. Until the first time I asked him about it, he laughed. Are we really doing this? He said, shaking his head as he poured 2 fingers of his rare Japanese whiskey. You're better than this, Jules. That was always his line when I got too close to the rot under our polished surface. You're better than this. As if questioning his loyalty made me pedestrian. As if catching a lie in his voice meant I was insecure. And insecurity, to Marcus, was cheap. I didn't press. Not that night. Maybe not even the next few. But something in me shifted. I began watching. Not the way he wanted me to. All adoring eyes and manicured grace. I watched with the quiet patience of someone who has finally stopped lying to herself. I noted the subtle wardrobe changes, the silk ties I hadn't bought, the new cufflinks he claimed were gifts from a client. I tracked the weekends he extended business trips in cities we never used to travel to, and I started listening to the elevator dings at 3 a.m., and to the conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, to the way he said Jules, like it was an obligation rather than a name. Then came the charity gala. It was our 5th year attending as a couple. I wore the navy gown he once said made me look like royalty. But that night, his eyes slid past me like I was background noise. She was there. I didn't need confirmation. One look at her. 30, blonde, body like a ballerina with a trust fund. And I knew. I watched them from across the ballroom. The way his hand lingered on the small of her back. The way she laughed with her entire body, as if she'd never had to hold pain inside her ribs. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked away. Not just from the gala. From him. From the facade I'd carefully polished with gratitude and blind loyalty. I booked a room at a modest boutique hotel downtown. No suite, no concierge with white gloves. Just me and a king-sized bed and a bottle of wine I didn't have to pretend to enjoy. The next morning I called my lawyer. And that's when I learned the second crack had already formed. Marcus had filed for divorce 2 days earlier. No warning. No conversation, just a packet of legal documents that outlined in cold precision what I was worth to him. A settlement that wouldn't cover a fraction of my lifestyle. No alimony, a few assets, frozen pending review. He even kept the damn dog. And scrawled in the margins of the financial summary, in his assistant's precise handwriting, was a note I would never forget. Per Mr. Stone's request, ensure Mrs. Stone is removed from yacht access codes immediately. That's when I realized this wasn't heartbreak. This was war. Tom Naganir. You know that moment in a chess game when the queen sacrifices herself, and everyone watching assumes it's over? That's what Marcus thought he'd done to me. Sacrificed the queen. But he forgot. I was never playing his game. I was learning it. The morning after I received the divorce papers, I sat in that tiny hotel room with a cappuccino from the cafe downstairs, and a stack of legal documents fanned out across the bed. It was quiet. No echo of luxury, just the low hum of traffic and the faint ache in my chest where belief used to live. I'd read those papers a dozen times the night before, grief-drunk and humiliated. But now, sober, emotionally and legally, I began to read between the lines. His lawyer underestimated me. Buried in the asset list was a holding company I didn't recognize, Argento Blue, LLC. It was listed under Ancillary Maritime Investments. One line. No valuation. Maritime. I remembered it instantly. The code Marcus once used when calling his yacht broker. Check Argento's calendar, he'd said casually. I'd thought it was an assistant. Turns out, Argento Blue was the company that held the title to his prized possession, the $12 million yacht he loved more than he ever loved me. He never expected me to connect the dots. But I did, and that's when I called Nadia. If you've ever been in a bad marriage, you know, every woman keeps a lawyer's number in her back pocket. Not the one your husband knows about, the one you keep like a spare key under a planter. Nadia was mine. Fierce, meticulous, and most importantly, someone who once told me, they think we won't fight. That's where they lose. We met at a corner table in a quiet cafe in Tribeca. I showed her the documents, my voice steady now, no longer begging for clarity. She flipped through the pages, her brows lifting once, then again. Did you sign a prenup? Yes, I said, but I also signed every quarterly report for his business. My name's on at least 5 of those companies as co-founder. Her eyes sparkled. Did he file taxes jointly the last 3 years? I nodded. And you have copies? All of them, and receipts. I kept everything. She closed the file with a smirk. He's going to regret thinking you were decoration. That line stayed with me. It wasn't about revenge yet. Not exactly. It was about dignity, about standing up without making a scene. Not yet. But in that moment, with legal precedent on my side, and the truth hidden in the margins of his arrogance, I began to feel the first embers of power returning to my chest. And if you've ever been underestimated, if someone ever looked you in the eye and assumed you were too soft to survive, then you'll want to stick with me, because this is where it gets good. If you're here for how I turned legal footnotes into financial freedom, make sure you follow. The way this unfolds will surprise you. Over the next 6 weeks, Nadia and I quietly built a case. We traced shell companies, found email threads with my name CC'd as strategic partner, his mistake. We documented every dinner with investors where I was seated at the table, introduced as the brains behind the branding. That branding, now worth millions, had my fingerprints on every campaign. Meanwhile, Marcus flaunted his freedom like a child with stolen candy. He posted soft launch photos of her, sipping wine on the deck of my former yacht, laughing in angles that conveniently obscured her face. He thought I'd see them and shatter. I saw them and smiled. Because what Marcus didn't know was that Argento Blue had a clause, one his lazy lawyer hadn't scrubbed, allowing for ownership reassignment upon audit discovery of misrepresentation. In plain English, if I could prove my contributions were omitted in bad faith, I could file for partial ownership. And I did. I didn't scream. I didn't post cryptic quotes on Instagram or send him threatening texts. I filed the petition through Nadia. Quiet, clean, devastating. And just like that, Marcus received a court summons in the middle of a weekend trip to Cannes. A trip he'd bragged about online, tagging the location like it was a trophy. I wasn't playing anymore. I was orchestrating. The best part? The yacht broker who facilitated the Argento Blue title update was an old friend of mine, someone I once helped secure investor funding with a single introduction. He owed me a favor. And favors. They're stronger than fury. So when Marcus tried to schedule his beloved yacht for a July charter, he was told it was currently under legal review pending transfer of title. According to the broker, he went pale. Oh, and I made sure C was there when he got the call. You'll want to follow this channel, because next you'll see exactly how I turned his yacht into my revenue stream. There's something sacred about silence before a storm. Marcus thought the silence meant I was broken, that I'd slink away, too embarrassed to face the world without his shadow. What he didn't realize was that silence, for a woman like me, isn't surrender. It's strategy. 2 weeks after he was served the petition, I received an email from the yacht management company. Subject line: transfer of ownership, preliminary approval. The message was brief. Legal ownership was pending a final ruling, but operational control, already mine. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I opened my laptop and began redesigning the brand identity of the yacht, formerly known as the Perseus. That name had always irritated me. Marcus picked it, some grandiose metaphor about slaying monsters and conquering chaos. But the real chaos was never external. It was in the way he dismissed my instincts, ignored my contributions, and referred to my design degree as a hobby with high heels. So I renamed it Revenant. It means one who returns. Fitting for a woman who came back not for closure, but for control. I hired a crew I trusted, changed the interior accents to soft bone-white linens and slate-gray marble, and removed the cigars and overpriced whiskey Marcus had treated like artifacts in a museum of his ego. Then I launched a new charter site. Clean, discreet, premium. Within 72 hours, we had 5 inquiries, 3 from names I recognized from Marcus's contact list. I didn't reject them. I scheduled them all. And when the calendar was full, I opened Instagram. C had posted again. She was reclined on the deck, glass of rosé in hand, tagged at private location. She wore the sunglasses I once left on that boat, the kind Marcus said didn't suit me because they're too bold for your face. I took a screenshot, not out of bitterness, but for evidence, because she had tagged the location wrong. And now, that yacht had a new registration, new name, and an entirely new paper trail. She wasn't just lounging on a stolen narrative, she was trespassing. So I sent a formal notice through my legal team to Marcus's charter intermediary, informing them the vessel was no longer available for personal use unless formally booked through my company. At market rate, I priced it aggressively, just high enough to sting, but low enough for temptation. 2 days later, his assistant booked it under a shell company for a private Mediterranean excursion, and I let them. When they arrived, the crew greeted them with the same chilled towels, the same welcome champagne, but under my branding, with my legal documents in place, and my cameras discreetly embedded for security. I didn't watch the footage live. I wasn't interested in pain. I was interested in power. That night, while Marcus and C floated off the coast of Corsica, toasting their illusion of untouchable status, I finalized a meeting with one of his former investors, someone who had grown disillusioned with Marcus's leadership style and reached out to me privately. Turns out, they'd followed the quiet unraveling, noticed the missing pieces, wondered why Marcus's quarterly projections had slipped. He wanted a new venture partner, and I had capital. Quiet capital, acquired through small advisory deals and a design portfolio I'd grown while Marcus was too busy playing mogul to notice I'd been building a brand under a pseudonym. So when I tell you that the yacht wasn't revenge, it was just the opening move. Believe me. The real play was still unfolding. And if you've ever been told that you were only relevant because of who you were with, keep listening, because proving them wrong isn't loud. It's lucrative. If you're still with me, follow the channel. This next chapter, that's when the empire starts. The morning Marcus disembarked the Revenant, he texted me for the first time in weeks. Marcus, you renamed my boat? I waited a full hour before replying. Me, you renamed our marriage. I thought you'd understand. He didn't text back. But later that day, his assistant sent a formal inquiry asking if he could reserve the Revenant for an upcoming holiday in Ibiza, for twice the usual rate. I accepted. I made sure the crew knew. Treat him like any other client. Cordial, discreet, professional. But when they opened the guest welcome binder, they'd find something new. A personalized message from the owner. Welcome aboard the Revenant. She sails not just with elegance, but with memory. May you enjoy the journey. And beneath that, my name, in bold. Now for those who understand that silence is a weapon, don't just listen. Follow. The next chapter takes us beyond yachts, into the legacy he tried to erase. There's a moment, quiet, precise, when people start to shift their gaze, not because you demanded their attention, but because you made them curious. That's when power changes hands, and Marcus never noticed when it started. While he drank his way through Amalfi on my chartered yacht, I was sitting in a high-rise boardroom in London, across from 2 men who had once called me the designer wife. Now they called me ma'am. Their firm had backed Marcus's last startup, a flashy AI platform with big projections and even bigger overhead. When I arrived for the meeting, they assumed I was there to negotiate on Marcus's behalf. I'm not here for him, I said, placing my portfolio on the table. I'm here to build something he never had the vision for. They exchanged a look. The one men give each other when they're recalibrating everything they assumed. What followed was a 30-minute pitch. No frills, no ego, just numbers, forecasts, and a sleek rebranding strategy for a legacy design firm I'd quietly acquired through one of Marcus's ex-consultants. She'd jumped ship the moment she heard who was at the helm. And I didn't just bring a concept. I brought receipts, growth charts, branding roadmaps, licensing contracts. At the end of the presentation, I slid across a single page, a signed commitment from a luxury resort chain in Dubai, ready to relaunch all their visual identity under my firm's direction. Marcus never mentioned this, one of the men said quietly. That's because Marcus never saw me, I replied. They funded me that afternoon, and with that capital, I did what Marcus never thought I'd do. I stepped into his world, not as a guest, but as a competitor. You want to know what real revenge looks like? It's not screaming, it's replacing. That week, I filed for trademark ownership of 2 product names Marcus had quietly let expire, branding I had created, designed, and pitched during our marriage. He thought they were useless. I turned one into a capsule line for a luxury skincare brand, and the other into a licensing deal with a travel tech platform. Every one of those names had a history, a memory, a moment I'd once let him take credit for. Now, they had my name on the contracts. But the move that changed everything came from a dinner I almost didn't attend. An old acquaintance, someone from Marcus's college circle, invited me to a private investor event in Manhattan. The kind Marcus used to say was above my pay grade. I showed up in a black suit, no jewelry, no fanfare, just clarity. Halfway through the evening, I found myself seated next to Claudia Hill, founder of Hill & Fox Ventures, one of the few female-led capital firms in the city. She'd heard about the yacht, the rebrand, the silence. I like women who don't flinch, she said. We talked for hours. By dessert, she offered me a slot on a funding round Marcus had been circling for months, and she let me present first. When I did, I didn't mention Marcus once. I let my work speak for itself, my numbers, my vision, my plan. When I finished, she leaned back and smiled. He always said you were creative, she said. He just forgot creativity scales. She invested. That night, walking out into the cool air of Manhattan, I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was building something that would make his empire look like scaffolding. And if you've ever been told you're not enough to lead, not sharp enough to win, not serious enough to be seen, follow this journey, because you don't need their permission. You just need a plan. Weeks later, Marcus texted me again. Marcus, why are my investors calling you? I let the message sit for a full day. Then I replied, they aren't your investors anymore. He didn't respond, but I heard through a friend that he started showing up to meetings late, that he looked distracted, that someone at a panel asked about the yacht, and he couldn't answer without getting flushed. That's the thing about men like Marcus. They build their empires on image. I build mine on impact. And while he scrambled to hold on to what was left of his brand, I was quietly preparing for the next move, one that would take the one thing he valued even more than control, his name. If you've stayed this long, you know the game's only just begun. Follow for the next chapter, where legacy meets its reckoning. There's a difference between visibility and relevance. Marcus never understood that. He thought having his face in magazines, his quotes in tech blogs, and his overpriced suits on panels made him untouchable. But influence, real influence, doesn't come from press. It comes from trust, from timing, from showing up where it matters, even if no one sees you walk in. And I had all 3. It started with a whisper, one article, a think piece from a mid-tier business writer titled, Why Women-Led Design Firms Are Quietly Dominating the Luxury Market. I wasn't even the focus, just a footnote. A line at the end. Sources say Revenant Studios under new leadership has closed deals that top-tier firms spent years chasing. But the right people noticed. Marcus's publicist called him in a panic. He fired her 3 days later. While he spiraled, I grew. Revenant Studios wasn't just a name. It was a signal that something old had been reborn sharper, cleaner, untethered from his legacy. I launched a quarterly digital zine featuring our portfolio, future concepts, and anonymous client highlights. Quiet flexes, minimalist design, the kind of aesthetic Marcus used to call too subtle to sell. It sold. And then, the panel invite came in, the one Marcus had been lobbying for since before the divorce. Futurescope Global, visionaries in design and tech. They didn't invite him. They invited me. The irony? The event was sponsored by one of Marcus's former investors, now a Revenant partner. They didn't ask me to speak about him. They didn't even mention him. They wanted me to talk about legacy reinvention. I almost said no. Not because I was nervous. I wasn't. But because part of me still feared being linked to him in any room, even by association. But Nadia reminded me of something during one of our late-night calls. You don't owe him invisibility, she said. Your presence is not a reaction. It's a statement. So I went. black jumpsuit, hair back, clear eyes. I walked onto that stage and told a room of 600 founders, CEOs, and editors how I built trust with brands Marcus had ignored, how I leveraged empathy in design, how I understood the psychology of luxury, not from boardrooms, but from living inside a world where status was currency. And I said this, near the end. I was once told I was only valuable in proximity to power, so I stopped standing next to it, and I became it. The room was silent. Then it erupted. They printed that quote on the cover of the conference recap. It went viral, not overnight, but in quiet waves across networks Marcus had once dominated. And here's the part that still makes me smile. 3 days after the conference, Marcus launched a rebrand campaign for his firm. Glossy, expensive, clearly rushed. And in the footer of the campaign's microsite, the place most people never look, was a list of acknowledgments. At the very bottom, design inspiration provided by early creative collaborators. He didn't name me. Of course not. He couldn't. But I saw it. So did Claudia Hill, who forwarded it to me with a note. He's trying to borrow your shadow. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because that same week, I received an offer to license one of my branding concepts to a global fashion house. They'd seen my work at the conference. Their creative director said, "There's something about your aesthetic. It feels like restraint finally taking the lead." I signed the deal that Friday, 7 figures. And just like that, Marcus's rebrand was old news. His firm's name trended below mine. His client roster thinned. And when a popular design podcast did a breakdown of his campaign, they compared it to my work, and not in his favor. One of the hosts said, "It feels like he's mimicking something he doesn't understand." He was, because you can't copy presence. You earn it. And if you've ever been dismissed as just a support act, if someone ever told you your worth expired the moment you left their orbit, follow this story. Because relevance isn't something they give you. It's something you take back. A few days later, I ran into someone from Marcus's old PR team at an art gallery opening in Soho. We made polite conversation. She asked how I was. "Focused," I said. Then she smiled. "You know, back then we used to wonder what you actually did. Now we wonder how we never saw it." I didn't correct her. Let them wonder. Let them all wonder. Still here? Then you know. The next move isn't personal. It's foundational. Follow the channel. Chapter 6 changes the industry. There are 2 ways to erase a man. You can destroy his name, or you can redefine it so completely, so strategically, that even he starts to forget who he used to be. I chose the second, because by now Marcus's name still echoed in some corners of the industry, but it was fading, not violently, quietly, like an outdated ringtone you hear in a crowd, and no longer turn your head for. And I had the microphone now, not literally, although I had started giving interviews, carefully chosen ones, not tabloids, not gossip blogs, legacy publications, the kind that don't trade in scandal, but in influence. My first appearance was in a long-form piece titled "Building After the Break, The Women Redefining Luxury Leadership." I was one of 3 profiles. No one mentioned Marcus. They didn't need to. The writer described my transition like a study in transformation. She left the party, took the blueprints, and built a better house on the hill. It was elegant, subtle, and devastating, especially when the article went viral in investor circles. That same week, a podcast I'd turned down twice invited me again, this time with full editorial control. I agreed, but with one condition. We wouldn't speak about my ex-husband, not directly. The host was smart. She opened with, "You were once part of someone else's narrative. Now you seem to be writing your own. How did you make that shift?" I looked into the camera. My voice didn't shake. "I stopped asking to be included," I said, and started building the stage they thought I'd never reach. The clip hit 2.4 million views in under 48 hours, and in the comment sections, I saw a shift I couldn't have planned. Wait, wasn't she married to? She's the brains behind that brand. This makes so much sense now. Funny how the ones in the background usually end up running the show. That's the thing about public perception. You don't have to scream to change it. You just have to tell a better story. And mine had momentum. So I leaned in. We launched the Revenant Insight series, a limited-run digital collection where I interviewed women who had been adjacent to power and then built their own. CEOs, designers, strategists, all women with stories that mirrored mine in different keys. It wasn't about Marcus. It was about the pattern. And patterns, when presented right, become movements. The series exploded. Each episode ended with a message I wrote myself. We're not shadows. We're architecture. By the third week, national campaigns were quoting us. Fashion houses rebranded using language we pioneered. A tech conference reached out to co-host a satellite event based on the Revenant ethos. And through it all, I never said Marcus's name, but his silence said everything. Behind the scenes, I heard things. That he was losing speaking invitations. That former clients were calling him less. That someone asked him, during a private dinner, what it felt like to be the ex-husband of Revenant's founder. He didn't answer. Because here's the truth. I didn't just move on. I redefined what moving on looks like. It isn't blocking someone or burning every bridge. It's buying the land around theirs. And if someone ever told you your story only mattered when they were part of it, I'm telling you now, that was never true. You are not a footnote. You are the headline. And if you've stayed this far, follow the channel, because in the next chapter, I make sure the world knows exactly who was behind every success he claimed. 1 month after the podcast aired, I got an invitation. A private roundtable event hosted by one of the legacy firms Marcus always admired. The kind of thing he used to joke about sneaking me into. They didn't invite him. They invited me to keynote. And the theme? Redefining authorship. The quiet architects of power. I didn't respond right away. I walked to my window, looked out over the skyline, and thought about the woman I used to be. The one who found a lipstick-stained receipt and still blamed herself. Then I turned back to my laptop and replied, "Confirmed," looking forward to closing the narrative. I didn't rehearse the speech in front of anyone. No mirror, no friends, no recording devices. I wrote it alone, by hand, on thick cream-colored paper, sitting at the marble kitchen island of my new loft. The one I bought in my name, with my money, in the building Marcus once said was a little too modern for a wife. And when the morning of the event arrived, I folded the paper once, slid it into my bag, and walked out the door in silence. The round table was held in the glass atrium of a private investment firm in Midtown, 40 stories above the city. Morning light hit the walls in slow golden streaks, and the room smelled like polished wood and new opportunity. There were about 100 people, no cameras, no live stream, just industry leaders, old money, legacy names, and a handful of newcomers who had read about me and wanted to know if the myth matched the woman. It did. I took the stage when the moderator, a silver-haired exec from a global consultancy, introduced me as the mind behind one of the most impactful brand reinventions in recent years. Marcus used to say I was good at packaging. He meant it as a backhanded compliment. What he never understood is that narrative is power. Whoever owns the story owns the future. I stepped up to the podium. No slides, no performance, just the truth. I used to believe power had a shape, I began. A tone, a gender. I thought it spoke with certainty, looked like control, and came wearing suits that cost more than my entire apartment. The room chuckled softly. I was wrong, I continued. Power doesn't look like anything. Real power listens, waits, and when it speaks, it doesn't ask for attention. It shifts the temperature in the room. I told them how I once sat at the edges of decision-making tables, quietly noting the way men referred to women's instincts as vibes, and their own as vision. Then how I learned to translate creativity into numbers because numbers made them listen. How every time I was introduced as Marcus's wife, I mentally added the words, "and the architect of your favorite campaign." I never said his name. I didn't need to. They knew. Sometimes, I said, the most effective way to reclaim authorship is not to shout that you were erased. It's to show the final product, point to the foundation and say, "That was mine. You just didn't know it yet." Silence. Then a single clap. Then another. By the time I stepped down, the entire room was on its feet. Afterward, people approached in quiet waves. An editor from Forbes Women asked if she could quote me. A young founder whispered, "You just gave me language for a feeling I've carried for years." And in the corner, I saw someone I hadn't expected. David Klein, Marcus's former mentor, the man who had once called me a decorative afterthought. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "You were never the background," he said. "We just didn't know where to look." I didn't thank him. Instead, I said, "Then maybe next time you will." That night, back at home, I lit a single candle, poured a glass of wine, and opened the event recap email that had already landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Keynote moment. That was mine. You just didn't know it yet. They'd made my quote the headline. The story had shifted, permanently. And here's what I've learned. If someone ever stole your credit, twisted your presence into silence, or built their status using your labor, don't chase them. Outgrow them. If you've come this far, you already know. Follow this journey. Chapter 8 goes deeper, not into revenge, but into legacy. And legacy doesn't ask permission. The irony is that I never wanted his world. I didn't want the boardroom battles, the constant performance of dominance, the showy wins posted for applause. I wanted clarity, autonomy, the kind of quiet that feels earned, not given, the kind that sits at the back of a gallery, watching others shine, knowing you were the one who installed the lighting. But now, I found myself in a position I never asked for, and people were watching, not for scandal, not for the yacht or the divorce or the whispered past. They were watching for guidance. They wanted to know how I'd done it, how I'd gone from the woman with the folded napkin in her lap at investor dinners to the one building a blueprint others wanted to follow. I started getting invitations, not just to speak, but to lead. A tech accelerator asked me to join their advisory board. A venture firm in Stockholm offered me a partner seat. A luxury brand requested my presence at their global summit, not as a guest, but as a mentor. I accepted the ones that aligned with my values, declined the ones that came with hidden clauses or old reputations. Power, I had learned, is not what you're offered. It's what you choose. And then came the moment I hadn't planned for. A call from the foundation. It was a private initiative backed by 4 major female-led companies, dedicated to identifying and elevating women whose contributions had been historically erased or minimized. In business, art, science, law, they weren't asking me to speak. They were asking if I would help design the next phase. They wanted my framework, my philosophy, my eye. I didn't answer immediately. I flew to Portugal instead, to a small villa on the cliffs outside Lisbon. I walked barefoot through morning light, drank espresso in silence, and asked myself a question I hadn't dared consider. What do you do after the story ends? Because that's what the last chapter had felt like, an ending. But as I looked out at the Atlantic, watched the tide erase footprints from the sand, I realized endings are a myth. There are only transitions. So I called them back, and I said yes. We launched 6 weeks later, the Revenant Collective, a living archive, mentorship platform, and seed fund dedicated to supporting women who were adjacent to power and ready to claim their own. No ads, no influencers, just truth. Our first initiative? A series of immersive retreats for women who had exited partnerships, marriages, or companies under quiet injustice, and were ready to rebuild. It sold out in 4 hours. One of the attendees, a former CFO whose husband had taken full credit for their startup's success, pulled me aside during a workshop and said, "I didn't come here to learn. I came here to remember." That stayed with me, because remembering is a radical act, especially when the world tells you to forget, to move on, stay quiet, be grateful for what you got. And if you're reading this, still following, still with me, then maybe you need to hear it too. You don't have to inherit someone else's castle. You can learn the tools and build your own. The message came through my assistant's filtered inbox, from Marcus Stone. Subject, coffee. It had been 16 months since our last conversation. Longer, maybe. I didn't count. Not after I stopped needing closure. Because that's the thing about silence. It becomes enough when you stop expecting anything to fill it. I let the message sit for 3 days. Not to punish him. To consider. Because I wasn't the same woman he left. And I needed to decide whether giving him space in my life again, even temporarily, was for clarity or nostalgia. Eventually, I replied. 1 hour. Public place. My choosing. He agreed. We met at a quiet cafe in the West Village. No crowd. No cameras. No curated corner table like the ones he used to demand. He arrived in a black coat. No watch. No arrogance. At first glance, he looked smaller. Not physically, but something in his posture. His silence. "Jules," he said, standing as I approached. I didn't hug him. I didn't offer warmth. I simply nodded and sat down. The first few minutes were polite. Weather. Travel. Work. Though he stumbled there. He asked if I was still with the yacht thing, and I corrected him softly. It's now a multi-brand consultancy and capital initiative. The yacht was just the first asset. He nodded. I've been following it, he said, quietly. I raised an eyebrow. You always did prefer watching to acknowledging. That stung. I could see it, but I didn't say it to hurt him. I said it because truth deserves oxygen. Then came the real reason he was there. I didn't handle things well, he said finally. You didn't deserve that. There it was. Late. Unnecessary. But not unwelcome. I know, I said. I thought I was building something. He continued. But you were the foundation. And I chipped away at it without ever understanding that. I looked at him. Really looked. This man once crafted an entire empire of perception. Now he looked like someone trying to remember who he was without the shine. Do you regret it? I asked. Every day. I believed him. But I didn't need the apology. Not for validation. Not for closure. Not even for the memory of who I was back then. I needed it for what came next. Because peace, when real, isn't passive. It's power without edge. He asked if we could be friends. Or, and here he paused, if we could reconnect somehow. I smiled. Soft. Final. Marcus, I said, I'm not angry anymore, and I don't hate you. But the version of me that needed you no longer exists. He nodded. Slowly. Like a man watching a ship he once owned sail away. Not because it was stolen, but because it had outgrown his harbor. We parted with a handshake. As I walked away, my phone buzzed. A message from my assistant. Dubai investor confirmed. They want you to headline their summit. I looked back once. Marcus was still seated, alone, staring into a half-drunk coffee. And for the first time, I felt nothing but clarity. He left me with silence. I turned it into a brand. If you're still with me, follow the channel. Chapter 10 is where legacy meets expansion, and I step fully into the world he once kept me from. There was a time I sat in the back of rooms like these, quiet, observing, fingers pressed lightly against the stem of a wine glass I barely sipped from, unsure if my presence was welcome or merely tolerated. Now, the rooms waited for me to enter. Dubai was the beginning. Not the yacht deals, not the brand partnerships, not even the summit keynote. The beginning of something bigger, something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine while I was surviving. It wasn't about reclaiming space anymore. It was about designing a new one. The invitation came through a private network I'd been quietly curating for over a year. High-level women across industries. Some CEOs, some founders, others quietly pulling strings behind global movements no one saw coming. They asked if I'd be the anchor speaker for a summit on vision without permission. I said yes, and I brought my story with me, but not the edited, polished version they expected. I told them the real arc, how I used to define myself through someone else's clarity, how I once thought being chosen was the same as being seen, how I had spent years helping Marcus build a house in his name, without realizing I had all the blueprints for my own. And I told them this: legacy isn't what they remember about you. It's what they can no longer imagine without you. After the applause, a woman approached me backstage, skin like bronze, voice like silk, power humming behind her words. She was a minister of innovation from a Gulf nation, and said only this: we don't need more empires. We need architects. You build like one. Within weeks, I had 4 offers to expand the Revenant Collective across 3 continents. We launched chapters in Cape Town, Sao Paulo, and Jakarta, each one tailored, local-led, built with intentional equity. No branding for branding's sake. No photographs with forced smiles. Just real frameworks, real money, real results. One of our first programs helped a collective of women artisans in Bali license their designs globally, turning centuries-old patterns into protected creative property. Another funded legal literacy workshops for single mothers navigating asset theft after divorce. And through it all, I refused to let it become about me. Because this wasn't about a man anymore. Not even about Marcus. That chapter was closed. This was about every woman who had ever sat at the edge of brilliance, waiting for someone to invite her closer, only to realize the table was never meant for her, so she built her own. The media tried to spin the narrative. Ex-wife of tech mogul, now global powerhouse. From divorce to Dubai, the reinvention of Jules Stone. But I pushed back. I declined the ex-wife label in every interview. My team issued a simple correction to every outlet. Founder, architect, strategist, use her name. And slowly they did. Because when you control the narrative long enough, even the headlines have to adapt. Marcus reappeared in smaller ways. A panel here, a LinkedIn post there. His company merged with a firm that used to court me for advisory roles. I heard through contacts that he was pivoting, rebranding, starting fresh. Good for him, but I was too far ahead to look back. because I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was scaling. And if you've ever been told that you're only powerful in proximity to someone else's story, this is your reminder. That story ends where you decide. Mine ended in silence and began with a signature. Still here? You already know. Chapter 11 is the quietest and the loudest. It's where I stop proving and simply become. This isn't the story of a woman who took her life back. It's the story of a woman who discovered she never truly lost it. The house I live in now has no gates, no marble statues, no imported palms, but it has wide windows and warm wood and a small garden I tend with bare hands on Sundays. There are no headlines here, just breath, just peace. The Revenant Collective runs itself now, led by a council of women I used to mentor, now leaders in their own right. I check in, offer insight, but I no longer run it, because real leadership is succession. Legacy is what continues when you step away. I've written one book, not a memoir, a blueprint, for the woman just starting over, the one who doesn't want revenge, just relief. It's called The Quiet Rise. Sometimes I get letters, women telling me they left him, or stayed, or started again, or stopped hiding. I read them all. I write back when I can, and once a year I sail, not the yacht that I sold. It served its purpose, but a smaller boat, one I can steer alone. Just me and open water and the knowledge that the waves don't ask where you've been. They only ask where you're willing to go. So here's my final word. Not as someone who won, but as someone who returned. To herself. If this story moved you, share it. Not for me. For the next woman who needs to know she can begin again. Not with fire, but with stillness. When her wealthy, arrogant husband Marcus abruptly ends their marriage, believing she can't survive without his money or name, Jules begins a quiet, calculated reinvention. What starts with a crumpled receipt turns into a 12-chapter evolution, from betrayal to blueprint, humiliation to empire. Marcus severs ties, strips her of access, and laughs from the deck of a yacht he assumes he owns. But Jules, underestimated and overlooked, finds power in the silence he leaves behind. She uncovers the hidden shell company tied to the yacht, builds a legal case, and reclaims what was once hers. Not just the vessel, but the narrative. Through strategy, mentorship, and quiet disruption, Jewel transforms from a woman standing behind a man to the architect of an industry movement. She doesn't just take revenge. She makes his relevance obsolete. She redefines leadership on her own terms, inspires a global network of women, and walks away not to disappear, but to expand. By the time Marcus returns, humbled, it's too late. She doesn't need vengeance anymore. She has peace. This isn't just a revenge story. It's a reminder. Power doesn't shout. It listens, waits, and rises, quietly.